I'm here today with Andrew Silk. Andrew is a professor of terrorism, risk, and resilience at Cranfield University. He has a background in forensic psychology and criminology and has worked in both academia and for government. His primary research interests include terrorism, conflict, crime and policing, and he is internationally recognized as a leading expert on terrorism and low-intensity conflict. Thank you for coming to speak with me today, Andrew.
It's a pleasure.
Andrew, so much of your work sounds fascinating, and perhaps it's not one that's considered a traditional pathway for someone with a psychology background. Would you tell us a bit about how you got interested in this line of work?
Well, it's a fair question, and you're absolutely right. It's not a traditional background for a psychologist, and I think maybe a bit more so now than it was. But back in the 90s, when I originally started working on terrorism, that really was a very fringe topic for a psychologist to be interested in. I mean, there were extremely few psychologists who were looking at this area. And I think one of the reasons why I got into it, I was very interested in forensic psychology at the time. I was very interested as well in the psychology of conflict and psychology of war and a lot of issues around that. And I was lucky enough to be based at the Department of Applied Psychology at University College Cork in Ireland. And the head of the department at that time was Max Taylor. And Max is still a very, certainly at that time, very unusual character in the sense of he had already published quite a bit on the psychology of terrorism. And he, and I would still recommend some of the books that he brought out in the 80s and 90s are well worth having a look at now as well. But he was interested in this area, and prior to coming to UCC, he'd been based at University of Ulster in Northern Ireland, and he had done some work on the paramilitaries up there, and was interested in psychological issues around terrorism and political violence. And so having him at the department meant that there was an option then to do a PhD looking at terrorism. And so that's essentially how I got into it. If Max hadn't been at the department, I probably would have ended up doing a PhD, maybe with a more traditional forensic psych focus. But because he was there, I had a chance to look at terrorism. Now, it was early 90s when this happened, and it really, really was very, very fringe. But it was unusual, and that then meant that when I travelled further afield, you weren't running into many people who had an interest in looking at the psychology of terrorism, and so that in itself had a value. But that's essentially how it started. So it was kind of a combination of being in the right place at the right time, so to speak. Although Max did later warn me, get out of terrorism. It's a dead end. There's no future in it. You need to move into more mainstream forensic psychology. And it's kind of, I'll never let him forget that. But it was, 9/11 happens, and then that completely transforms the field. And it went from being a field where you had a handful of people who were seriously engaged in it to suddenly being much more mainstream, much more active. And the level of interest in it went up massively.
I mean, it is interesting, really, how this is a field that you were interested in, and then political and world events really made it be much more mainstream than it was when you started. So just thinking about your background then, or some of the things that you've done outside of academia, you've worked with a wide variety of government departments, law enforcement, security agencies. You've worked with the UK Home Offices, the Ministries of Justice and Defence. Internationally, you've worked with the United Nations, the US Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and that's just some of what you've worked with. I think it's really interesting and great that you've been able to provide a way for psychological research to make it into the government sector. Are you able to say anything about how you went from an academic background to working with the government?
Well, at one level, it came about as a result of leaving academia for a short period of time and taking a post with the Home Office in London. Now, that was actually, I had been based at the University of Leicester at that point, but a number of colleagues at Leicester had taken up posts with the Home Office, generally working within what was then called RDS, the research arm of the Home Office as it was at that time, and effectively working as researchers within government on a whole range of primarily related to crime issues. And so I was following a path that I had that was well trodden by colleagues, and so it paid a lot better than academia at the time too. I have to say that. But it was essentially that was reason to get into it. Now, when I started in the Home Office, they were effectively, realistically, doing no research whatsoever on terrorism and counterterrorism. It was a black hole, so to speak, in terms of receiving research attention. So initially, when I start, I'm working primarily on organised crime-related issues, and there are some parallels between organised crime and terrorism-related issues, but it's primarily organised crime. But obviously, even at that stage, I'd already published quite a bit on terrorism-related subjects, and so occasionally, when queries or questions came up that had a terrorism angle, it was kind of a case of who the hell do we have who can say something on this, and then it was kind of, well, Sil did something, didn't he, a few years ago. So it was kind of the terrorism stuff began to appear in terms of some of the research work, but it was, I would say, even by the time I'd left, it was still absolutely less than half. Most of what I was doing was organised crime related. Now, if you look at what the Home Office is doing today compared to what it was doing then, it's completely transformed. And now you do have a very major and very substantial research commitment to looking at the issues around terrorism and counterterrorism in a way that was unheard of back when I was there. Having worked for a couple of years in the Home Office, I then moved back into academia, heading to University of East London, where our paths eventually crossed.
Do you look back fondly on those days working at the Home Office, or is it more of it was good while you were there, but you're glad to be back in academia?
Well, it's I've always said, and I've always felt this, I was very glad I did it, because it does give you a very useful insight into the way that policy works and how policy is developed and the way that evidence is used to inform policy. And I think that was incredibly useful to have, particularly going forward in a career where I'm involved in a whole range of different projects, many of which have a stated aim of informing policy or guiding policy or feeding into the evidence base around it. And I think after having had a couple of years of being on the inside and seeing how it operates, it left me with a very I'd like to think realistic, other people might put it as pessimistic view in terms of how research does engage with policy, and it's kind of a case of don't expect too much is being the short answer. But it was a useful lesson to get early on, rather than thinking, yes, this is a brilliant piece of research, they absolutely should change policy as a result of it, and then being incredibly frustrated that they haven't. And I think you learn that there are lots of competing agendas and lots of different issues that are coming to play in terms of policy construction, and the evidence base or the research base is only one part of that, and it certainly doesn't dominate in my view. But I think it was as I've often said, it was really interesting work, and I really enjoyed doing it, but I also was absolutely happy to move back into academia when the time came. And so it was kind of a case of, yes, very glad I did it, very useful, but I was quite happy to move when the opportunity came up.
It's interesting then, because you came from a background in your degrees with a very applied focus, and then you went into government, which I think does also have this applied focus, and some of the work now that you're doing, again, is applied. If I were to change the perspective from government to a more open and applied sphere, how would you say your work is contributing to the idea of open psychology?
Well, we've talked about open psychology before, and we've talked about what does it mean, that is a challenge, because I think we already accept that open psychology means different things to different people. But there are a couple of elements in it that I think are absolutely key. One is that open psychology tends to be applied psychology. So it is applied to real world problems. And that's not criticism of theoretical psychology or other approaches like that. But open psychology has this applied focus. It's looking at real problems that are out there right now, and what can we do about them? How can we intervene with them in a positive way? And I think open psychology also tends to be receptive to interdisciplinary approaches, and that's certainly in my background. General is this interdisciplinary work. So I started off in a psychology department, but if you look back at my career, it's primarily been interdisciplinary. Quickly moved into criminology department, then climbed at the Home Office, then at UEL, where it was kind of law and criminology, and now where I am at the moment at Cranfield, where I'm based within the Cranfield Forensic Institute, which is a collective mix of archaeologists, anthropologists, forensic science people, and then me and a gang like me, and it's fantastic. That's pretty much in my career been the way I've worked. It's having this interdisciplinary approach, and if you're looking at a subject like terrorism, I think terrorism traditionally is an interdisciplinary subject. It's not owned by any one discipline. I think political science probably has the if you want, the longest stake on it. But you've had psychologists and others looking at this area for a very long time. And again, I go back to Max Taylor. He was already doing a lot of work back in the 80s. And other figures like Aaron Berardi and Martha Crenshaw, and some of the giants were in the field, also looked at this from a psychological perspective back as early as the 70s and 80s as well. So I think that, for me, is, again, when we think about open psychology, it's this applied focus. Terrorism is certainly a real world problem, and you've got a focus on that. You've got an interdisciplinary mix that are looking at it, and another issue I think with open psychology that often comes up is this concern with justice, and justice-related issues, and I think that's absolutely there as well, particularly when you're looking at terrorism and counterterrorism.
I think that's spot on, and the Open University, as you know, has a real social justice sort of agenda. But this also fits really well with some of the research we do here in the School of Psychology and Counseling at the Open University, and especially with one of our research groups, the Forensic Cognition Research Group, or FCRG. In FCRG, we work with people across disciplines, and also we work with people in several police forces. We think that linking with them is crucially important because it helps to inform policy, it helps to inform decision-making all around law enforcement and justice. So it's really good to hear that this is such an important aspect of your work as well, and that you're working with people from other disciplines who are also working in these areas. Can you tell us a bit about a project that you're working on now?
I would say, the project where findings are coming out at the moment is in relation to disengagement, de-radicalization. These are clearly important topics when we're thinking about terrorism, and we're thinking about, certainly when we're thinking about issues around criminal justice and justice responses to terrorism. And this work was involved carrying out a systematic review on the recent literature on disengagement and de-radicalization, trying to understand what are the key factors that are involved in this process. How does it happen? What's the research basically telling us? And one result of doing this systematic review is that we've developed a new model for understanding disengagement and de-radicalization from terrorism and violent extremism. And we've called it the Phoenix model. And the reason why we called it the Phoenix model is one of the findings that emerged from this was that transformation of identity seemed to be the foundation on which disengagement and de-radicalization happened, and that it was an individual sense of identity changing was the catalyst for a whole range of other impacts. And what we found, or what was uncovered, it wasn't necessarily that it was a completely new identity that was taking place or that was being built, but rather it was facets of a person's old identity were essentially being reborn. And these older facets had been essentially buried by the extremist or the terrorist identity or key elements of that. And then over time, they re-emerged and they became reinvigorated, and they became much more important to the individual. And it was this identity transformation which in a sense was one of the key factors in terms of disengaging them from active involvement in terrorism and violent extremism, and then potentially facilitating de-radicalization as well as disengaging from this process. So that's a piece of work that's happening right now, and some of the some of the early findings from that are just being published, and a couple of articles are coming out now in the next few months.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Are you working with a government group on this, or is this all academics who are doing that?
Well, it was a CREST-funded study. So you're probably familiar with CREST, based at the University of Lancashire. They act as funders for a whole range of not just terrorism, but security and policing related projects. And it was a team of academics who were involved in this: John Morrison and Roy Holloway, and some other researchers who were based there as well, and myself. And I had absolute pleasure working with them. And it was, it's in a sense the research was all academics, but it, as with a lot of CREST projects, the hope is that this is something that then would be read and would reach practitioners and policymakers, and not just be read by other academics.
Well, I will take a look at those articles that are out, and I'll be looking for the new ones. So thank you for adding to my reading list. That's very good. Many thanks for speaking with me today. It's been a pleasure having the opportunity to hear more about you, to hear about your background, and to hear about the most recent research you've been doing. So thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. It's been an absolute pleasure, and lovely to speak with you, as always.